Hello and welcome to the Frankenstein introduction lecture video. This is going to be a pretty long one, so do not feel like you need to try and get all of this in one sitting. As always, what I'm saying is probably more important, and there's more information in what I'm talking about than there is what's on the screen. So you will not get a very good grade if the only thing you write down is what you see on the screen. Now, Frankenstein was written by a woman named Mary Shelley, and we're going to need to talk a lot about her life and also the world she lived in, because we can see a lot of very clear connections between those things. And so we're going to start with Mary Shelley's parents, because, well, like all parents, they have a profound effect on their children, but we can see that effect in her writing. So we're going to start with the more famous of the two, her mother, which I know is somewhat unusual for like the 1750s. Mary Wollstonecraft was Mary Shelley's mother. And she is really probably best known for being one of the first, if not the first, feminist in Europe. She was an intellectual. And what that means is not that just that she was smart, because I'm sure she was, and that she was educated, because she was, of course. But an intellectual is somebody who pretty much spends their time and earns a living using their mind rather than their hands. And 1750s, 60s, 70s, that would have been very, very unusual for almost anybody to make a living with just their mind and what they can produce, their writings and talking. For a woman, that was unheard of. And so she's very, very unusual just because she can earn a living with her writing. And as that says, this is her book, and this is the book that you need to know for Mary Wollstonecraft. It is called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And I'm sure there's a lot more to this, but the takeaway with this book is she was talking about education and equal education between men and women, or boys and girls. And at the time period that Wollstonecraft was living, women in Europe were considered to be intellectually inferior to men. Like, they weren't smart. They weren't as smart. They really sincerely thought that a woman's reproductive organs somehow prevented her brain from ever developing as much as a man's could. And Mary Wollstonecraft very rightly pointed out that the bigger issue was the difference in the education that boys and girls were offered. Girls were not given the same amount of education. They weren't given the same opportunities. They'd be taught to read and write, but that was really probably about all. Wollstonecraft pointed out, rightly so, that boys and girls, women and men, were not given the same education. Women were taught to read and write mostly, as much, I mean, if you were the right class. But then beyond that, you would get very limited education. There were no public schools that girls could go to. You definitely could not go to university, college. And what few schools there were available to women really focused only on teaching them how to catch a husband, how to run a household. So what we think of as school today for women did not exist. And she pointed out, you know what? If we actually gave these women the same educational opportunities that we give men, you would not see the difference. And we are today, as I'm sitting here recording this and you're listening to it, we are proof that she was right. Because once we started educating boys and girls the same, we discovered that there's no difference in intelligence between men and women. Just like anybody else, there's some smart and there's some not smart. So Wollstonecraft was really uh, I guess, had a breakthrough here with this. And the other thing you need to know about her is she's working and living in a time when the vast majority of women writers cannot get published. If they show up at a publisher and they say, I have this book or I have this poem, or whatever they have, the publisher is going to reject them out of hand, not even reading it because it's a woman. And yet Mary Wollstonecraft was so influential and powerful enough, she could publish under her own name. For years after Wollstonecraft, women had to publish as either anonymous or they had to take a fake name, a male name, to get themselves published. And yet here she is in like the 1760s and 70s, publishing under her own name. So that really gives you a sense of how influential she was. Now, she was not just influential in Mary Shelley and her daughter's life because of her writing, although that was a big part of it. Wollstonecraft was not a follower. She did not really follow the rules. She slept around before marriage. She had affairs. I think she had an illegitimate child. And this was really the kiss of death in society in these times for a woman. I mean, the whole thing that they believed was that a woman's value was in the fact that she could be a virgin before marriage and then that she could give her husband children. And so Wollstonecraft, basically refusing to follow these rules, makes her very unusual and also pretty ostracized from her society. We can't say that it's not like there were no consequences for this behavior, because there were. So she had the illegitimate children. She attempted suicide. One of her lovers or her lover rejected her, and she basically kind of decided that that was the end of it. And I think she tried to jump off a bridge. Didn't make it, obviously, but still, very much did not follow the usual script for a woman of her time period. Okay, and then we get to Mary Shelley's father, William Godwin, who is also an intellectual. He's also a writer. He earns a living writing and publishing and talking. But where Mary Wollstonecraft we think of as a feminist, the word that William Godwin gets labeled with is radical. He had this kind of odd argument about government. He said that pause this for a second. William Godwin also kind of had interest in education. He thought that if you could just educate people correctly, that you wouldn't need to have laws or government because people would know how to act appropriately. He was not a militant anarchist. He didn't advocate the overthrow of the government. He just had this kind of this odd idea that all that really needed to happen to get rid of the evils of government and bureaucracy, I guess, was that you had to teach people the right way. And I don't have any idea exactly what he thought was the right way, but he would have also been very, his society would not have looked kindly on these ideas. And so within his circle of friends and associates, he would have been very popular, and people probably read his writing, some of them at least, just to kind of be shocked and appalled. But both he and Mary Wollstonecraft would have very much experienced being ostracized from society because they were so different from everybody else. Oh, William Godwin also advocated free love, which is I don't know if this is, I don't know when this phrase came about. I always associate it with the 1960s and the hippies. And basically, free love is the idea that you should be able to have sex with people that you're not married to. And so Godwin advocated this. He thought that, society's rules about sexual congress were old fashioned or whatever. He's going to rue that later once he has a child, let me tell you. So those are his parents. So now we have Mary Shelley. Her full name is Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. She took her mother's maiden name, but we're just going to call her Mary Shelley. And she is the author of Frankenstein, and we need to talk about her. I think I've got a painting for you. This is a painting of Mary Shelley. I always think she looks kind of sad in this, but this is, gives us an idea of what she looks like. Now, Mary Shelley very quickly experiences tragedy because her mother died, I want to say, within like 4 days of her birth, a victim of childbed fever. And childbed fever is something that in any civilization, in any society that has adequate medical care, doesn't exist anymore. Essentially, what it was the mother would perhaps have some sort of injury because of going through labor and have an open wound, and it became infected. And since they didn't know very much about how to deal with infection, women died. I can't even tell you how dangerous the death rate, the mortality rate for giving birth was, purely because women would get an infection and they didn't know how to solve it. And that's what happened to Mary Wollstonecraft. So Mary Shelley loses her mother before she even knew she had one. Her father, however, raised her. William Godwin is an excellent father, and he taught her to read, he taught her to write, he encouraged her to learn. So he definitely kind of continued the tradition of his family being intellectual and thinking for a living as opposed to doing something with their hands. Mary Shelley, we have to understand just how amazingly smart she had to have been. She published her first work when she was 11 years old, which is interesting and unusual. But the fact that it was a 37 stanza poem, I can't even imagine writing a 37 stanza poem as an adult, let alone as an 11-year-old. And yet she did, and it was good enough to be published. So we know from the get go that this is not your average writer. She is really extraordinary. She grew up as a part of her father's circle, and so all of the people that he knew and all of the ideas that they all thought about and talked about and tried to explain to people, she learned those things very early. And when she was 16, in one of those meetings with her family, with her father's friends and associates, she meets Percy Shelley, who is probably at the time not as famous as he was going to be, but Percy Shelley is an incredibly famous British poet. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your view, I guess, she fell in love with him. And I want to say he was not much older than she was. I mean, I don't even think he was 20 years old at this point. And he was already married and he already had kids. But Mary and Percy were so in love, they decided to abandon his family and ran away to mainland Europe together. You can see her parents' kind of unusual lifestyle. You can see that here in her. When I said that Godwin would regret advocating for free love, well, the fact that his 16-year-old daughter runs off with a married man, I think would probably say, maybe there is something to this society's rule thing. So they ran off to mainland Europe, which means not England, France, Germany, Switzerland, whatever. And they lived there together in sin for several years. It was just like, okay. Unfortunately, Percy's wife, the woman that he abandoned, after a few years after he left her, she kills herself. And Mary and Percy just get married after that. And the only good news I can give you here is that they did take in Percy's children with Harriet and did take very good care of them. And in fact, Mary Shelley is going to wind up raising these children because Percy's not long for the world. Um, of themselves, Mary and Percy have 4 children. Only one of them lives past 3. And I know that sounds shocking that they had a 75% mortality rate with their children, but that was not unusual. I looked up some statistics about kind of historical death rates of children, and I found one horrible statistic that said in Germany in the 19th century, so the 1800s, so about the time that they were having kids, 1 in 2 children died before the age of 5. The death rate today is, I don't know, 1%, 2%. And so the idea that you could lose 1 out of every 2 children you have, you can see how this is horrible, but it would not have been unusual for the time period. Like I said, Percy didn't live very long. He had tuberculosis. And tuberculosis is a disease that it destroys your lungs. It takes a very long time, like years, to do it. And you spend a lot of time coughing, you cough up blood, and essentially it attacks your lungs and kind of just melts them away. And there was no cure. And so if you got tuberculosis, you just dealt with the symptoms until you died. And so what they did was they moved to Italy because Italy had a warmer and a drier climate, which would mean less congestion and less stress on his lungs. But even less than 10 years after they got married, he's dead. Ironically, he doesn't die from the tuberculosis. He died from like a sailboat accident. But either way, Mary Shelley is less than 30 years old, and she has, I want to say, 3 or 4 kids. Her one surviving child, and then his children from the first marriage. And she has to take care of the whole family. And she does it. She does it magnificently. She earns a living to take care of her children, and at some point, she has to take care of her father as well for a period of time, purely through her writing. Frankenstein is what Mary Shelley is most famous for, but it is by far not the only thing she wrote. She wrote articles, she wrote essays, poetry, obviously. She has another novel that I don't remember what the name of it is, but it's basically the idea that there's only one man on the planet left. Like a disease has destroyed every other single man, and so you can see kind of this fascination with death, I guess, which we can understand considering how many people in her life die. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about well, the Romantic movement is going to be about kind of the style of writing that was going on while she was writing this book. And so, what we need to do first of all is let me explain what I'm talking about when I say movement. Um, a literary movement is kind of like the prevailing ideas. It's what's in style. And artists, writers, sculptors, musicians, architects, they all kind of, it's like everybody has kind of the same style in a certain time period, and it influences their writing. And so if everybody thinks a certain way about, let's say, nature, then that's going to show up in the art and literature. And the other thing I can think of as an analogy for this is the way the fashion world works. Think about it, how something that is really in style today, a year from now, whatever the opposite of what's in style today is what's going to be in style then. And so you get this kind of pendulum effect where just like in the fashion world, what's in style kind of completely reverses itself over time. And so the Romantic movement had a certain set of ideas, but it was in reaction to the movement before the Romantic movement, which we have to talk about. So we're going to back up and talk about classicism first, because if we understand classicism, then we can see that the Romantic movement is a reaction to it. So classicism basically comes from the word classic, and it was all about the ancient Greeks and to a lesser extent the ancient Romans. It was kind of, they thought that the ancient Greeks and Romans and the way that they thought and the way that they made their buildings and they dressed and they ran their governments, they thought that was just the coolest thing ever. So any sort of artist who was working in this time period would be influenced by those ideas. Here are some of the viewpoints of the classicists. The first thing is they really prized logic and rationality over emotion. They saw the Greeks as very civilized, birthplace of democracy and all that. The Romans so successful at spreading their government and way of life pretty much all over Europe, and so they saw this as the best possible way to live your life. And that means that in terms of literature, you're going to get a tremendous amount of nonfiction because they value rules and logic and explanations of things over, say, imaginative fiction like novels and fantasy and whatnot. The classicists saw nature as something there to be used. It didn't really have any value of itself. It was basically like raw materials, and you could do whatever you wanted with it because that was all that mattered. How could we use rocks or the field or the forest? How can we use this to make our life better? So that's really the idea behind the classicists. And then I'm going to start with, or I'm going to show you architecture and a couple of paintings, because I think the visuals can really explain these two movements. This is the Acropolis in Athens, Greece. And obviously it's very much in ruins today, but you can still see the style of it, right? You can see the tall fluted columns. Notice that if at the top of that you've got some decoration, it's kind of falling apart, but you can tell it's there. And the idea behind this Greek architecture was everything was very clean and equal and orderly. Orderly is kind of the words of the day for the classicists' architecture. And so this is ancient Greece. This is how and to a lesser extent the Romans. The Romans are going to imitate the Greeks as well. Now, this is a modern building, and you see that even though it is clearly a modern building, it was not, built thousands of years ago. It looks exactly like the Acropolis. It has the same kinds of columns. It has the same clean lines. Everything's very equal, um, very calming. You've got the decorated frieze at the top. So very much, they really loved this ancient Greek and Roman style. And we continue to find that attractive. Look at this. This is the Congress building in Washington, D.C. You know from looking at photographs or visiting Washington, D.C., that all of the main government buildings look like this. They are all white. Most of them have columns of some sort. You can tell when Washington, D.C. was built. It was built during the classic period because all of the buildings are styled like that. And we still consider this to be an attractive style today. We have a much broader variety of building styles that we could choose from if you decide to build something today. But this is still an option. I mean, people don't look at this and think, oh, that's old fashioned, it's ugly, let's tear it down and build something new. No, no, no. This is still an attractive in use style. Now, paintings. This is a painting from the classic period, and I'm going to show you. This is a painting of a young girl, and I'm going to show you another painting of a young girl in a little bit in the Romantic era, and you can see the difference. So, looking at this, obviously, you've got a Greek setting. She's sitting on a piece of furniture, and you've got that whatever that little thing sticking up to the side that probably has some sort of oil in it. You could light some sort of lamp. Very Greek looking. Her dress is all white, very simple. Her hair, the headband and the curls is a classic Greek style. So they imitated even down to like hairstyles and clothing. They imitated the ancient Greek look. But the other things that are more subtle about this painting that indicate when it was made are that she is very posed. She's very calm. She is clearly posing for a picture. This is not like a candid photograph where you catch somebody and they don't know you're doing it. This painter is following the rules of painting. The subject is posed. She's looking clearly at the artist. Um, the other thing I would point out are the colors, very muted. You almost have a sense of age with these colors, like they were trying to make the painting look like it was from the time period of the Greeks. So this is a very kind of classic painting from this time period. Now, we're going to switch gears and talk about the Romantic period, which is when Mary Shelley was writing. Now, first of all, when I say romantic, I do not mean a romance novel, what we think of as romantic today. This is more about, it's a literary time period, and it's going to be more about emotion and imagination. It's not just about love. So to the Romantics, remember I said that the literary periods were always in reaction and the opposite of what came before. So the classicists were all about logic. Well, so the Romantics seem to go to the other end of the spectrum and say that imagination is the ultimate creative power. Which the reason that I want you to know about the Romanticism period is because to a large extent, a large part of the world we live in today and what we like and don't like, um, and think about art this is still with us. Like in some ways we're still in the Romantic period, and imagination being the ultimate creative power is really it's something we still kind of value. The image of the artist who can just kind of sit down and like a novel just flows from her pen without any sort of revision. This is where that idea came from. That if an artist is truly inspired, she or he should just be able to write down and it just comes to them. It's not hard work, it's just a gift. And we know, from writing, even if just the little you've written for me, that's a whole load of crap. Writing is hard work, but that's where the idea comes from. They valued emotion as much as logic. I'm not going to tell you that the Romanticists thought that logic was worthless, because that's not the case, but they gave emotions equal time. And nature, they saw nature very much differently than the classicists. The classicists saw nature as simply something there to be used up, whereas the romantics thought nature was divine inspiration. This was like where they went to get inspiration. It gave them ideas. They kind of saw nature as, God's work, and so it should be respected and protected. This line where it says that it's a refuge from the artificiality of civilization, that basically means that, whenever society's got you down, whenever you just can't stand people anymore, go out into the wilderness and refresh yourself and find new inspiration. That idea is still with us today. I mean, if you've ever watched a car commercial for like Jeeps where they go and, they off-road, that is that idea, is that, if you can get away from your everyday life in the city, that you can find joy and happiness. That is exactly what the romantics thought, and that's what we still think that way. And this is going to be a big deal in Frankenstein too. You're going to see a lot of reference to nature, especially as a healing, something that can heal the characters and make them feel better. So that's going to be really easy to see. Okay, so some paintings. This is a romantic era landscape painting, and it's very distinctively romantic. You can always tell a romantic era landscape because they all look the same. Um, the sky is huge, and there's all this nature going on. And if there are people at all in a romantic era landscape painting, they're very, very small and insignificant. And if you look really right here in the very center of this painting, I think that's a little guy. But the idea was that these painters wanted to show us how insignificant humans were compared to the majesty of nature. And this painting's very true. I mean, this is a gorgeous painting, but it does not look like something where humans are in control. You've got this ruin here that nature is taking over humanity's things here. So very much a real classic romantic painting. Oh, and then one little piece of architecture. There's not nearly as much romantic architecture as there is the classicists, just because, I mean, how can you beat the classics? This is Pina Palace, and it is in Portugal in a little town called Sintra. And you see how different this is from like pictures of the White House or the Congress building or the Acropolis. It just kind of is wild. You've got all of these brilliant colors. There doesn't seem to be a lot of plan. I mean, it almost looks like the architecture just went, oh, hey, I want a column here. Oh, no, I want another one over here. Well, I liked this color, so I'll put this color here, but I really want that color over there. It just is kind of almost like a child creating this castle. So a very different, much looser, not as rigid, doesn't follow like these, it has to look the same rules to see this. And this is actually, Sintra is kind of the city of castles. It's actually up in the mountains. And when I say mountains, not like the Rockies, because, well, Portugal doesn't have mountains like the Rockies, not that high, but for Portugal, they're pretty high. But anyway, Sintra was kind of like a resort town for kings and queens and the really wealthy. And so there are like 5 or 6 palaces within probably a 10-mile radius around Sintra. But the problem is that it's a mountain town. And so you're constantly driving up and down hills, and the roads are very small and narrow. And so even though you've got 5 castles in a 10-mile, area, it can take you days or hours and hours to travel between them just because the traffic is so terrible. This is a beautiful picture. I cannot, however, suggest you go to Sintra. This is a painting, romantic era painting. Again, I wanted to show you, kind of the single woman painting, and you can see very much how different this is. The first thing I notice about this is she's not looking at the artist. This almost looks like a candid photograph where the artist captured her getting ready to do something else. She's not following the rules. This artist is not following the rules of, classic posed painting. The colors are a lot more vivid. It just seems to be a very different style. And you see that in writing too, because the writers are going to really let their imaginations do whatever they want. If you come up with an idea, let's go for it. And definitely, I mean, obviously, Frankenstein is going to fit that bill. The other thing And probably what you're going to recognize the most from the Romantic period is the concept of what we call the romantic hero. And the romantic hero, um, essentially, I'm going to describe him to you, and you're going to be able to think of probably every movie you've watched in the last 10 years and go, oh, yeah, that's that guy. So the romantic hero has several characteristics. First of all, he is emotional. He allows himself to have emotions. He can get angry. He can get sad. He can be happy. He does not try to repress his emotions. He doesn't try to, be the stern and forbidding and emotionless man. He lets himself be angry and emotional. He also is very pro individual. The romantic hero, and you'll recognize him, is the guy who does what's right because he thinks it's right, regardless of what society or the rules or the government or the laws say. And that is pretty much every hero we can think about today. They do what they think is right, and they value the individual person more than the group. And so they choose to save one person because that's the right thing to do, even if it means they're going to get in trouble, because it's the right thing to do. So think about the movies and the books and the television programs that we watch, and that's pretty much a definition of almost all of the heroes. The other, let me get on. Um, the romantic hero is very often an outcast. He does not fit in, and he doesn't really care that he doesn't fit in. And when I first started researching the romantic hero, the character that came to mind the most for me was from the Lethal Weapons movies. The Mel Gibson character he's like this rebel cop who keeps running through partners because he can't get along with anybody. He never follows the rules, and he's very emotional, and he, has these fits of rage, but he does not fit in. And I think again that's this idea of the outcast as hero comes from this time period. Um, think about how many times the antagonist is some nerdy government official, or if it's a police movie, like the captain, the police captain, the police chief, or whatever, who's all about following the rules. And he gets really angry when the hero refuses to do that. And then the hero, of course, always triumphs in the end. And that not following the rules was the right thing to do. But that comes from this time period. This is a painting. This is a painting of Napoleon, who was the emperor of France and tried to conquer all of Europe. But this is a good example of a Romantic era period painting. There's lots of movement, lots of color, lots of drama. Obviously, this is made up. I mean, you're never going to be able to have a horse pose like this. So it's a completely made up picture, but it's also very kind of romantic hero-esque. He's by himself. It looks like he alone can solve the problem. He's pointing, dramatically. He's got that big red cloak that's all over the place. So a wonderful propaganda piece for look at my strong leader. He's going to lead us to victory. All right. So that wraps up the Romantic era. And that really just kind of tells you some of the influences that influenced her writing. Now, what we need to do is move on to the world she lived in. And probably the thing that's going to influence the writing of Frankenstein the most is death and medicine in Mary Shelley's time. And so we're going to talk about the status of healthcare in the 17th and 18th centuries. The first thing you need to know is that almost any illness could be fatal. Today, the quality of our healthcare is such that we get injured in some small ways and in some really large ways, and we really don't think of it as, oh my gosh, I could die from this. Like breaking a bone in childhood. That's traumatic, it's painful, it's annoying, but we generally don't think that a broken bone could cause death. And that's a whole different world from the world that Mary Shelley was living in, because they didn't have any conception of how to deal with infection. So if you developed an infection, you had to write it out. You really only had to rely on your body's resources. And so people died. So that's the first thing you need to know, is that really almost any injury or illness could kill you. The next thing you need to understand is they didn't understand the connection between illness and diet. And I'm not talking about, how we are always looking for the next superfood that will magically solve all of our problems. I'm talking about really basic things, like if you don't have enough of this nutrient, you will die. If you don't eat this vitamin, you will die. Those things in our world today, thankfully, are exceptionally rare. To experience this kind of problem in today's world, you need to go to a country that has no infrastructure and no healthcare at all to find somebody like that. So there were two big diseases I want to talk about that were entirely due to a vitamin deficiency. The first one is scurvy. Scurvy was the disease that sailors got whenever they were on ships for months and months. And what happened was you would start to lose your teeth, you would start to lose your hair, and then you died an exceptionally slow and painful death. And they didn't know what the problem was. And then eventually somebody discovers it's a vitamin C deficiency. That's it. That's all you have to do to solve it. And so they started stocking citrus fruits on board ships. And the reason I've got the picture of the limes here is that the British, for whatever reason, like to stock limes on their ships, on the British Navy ships. And so you can still sometimes hear British sailors referred to as limeys, purely because they liked limes. They could get limes better than lemons or oranges or whatever. So scurvy was a vitamin C deficiency. They didn't know that. The other disease is called rickets. And rickets is when you don't get enough vitamin D, calcium, and phosphorus. All of the things that you get from milk, from drinking milk, if you don't get those things, you develop rickets. And it meant that your bones didn't develop the way they were supposed to. Particularly, it attacked leg bones. I'm not really sure why. Today, the only children who suffer from rickets are the ones who live in incredibly poor conditions, and don't get enough of really basic nutrition. But it was a common disease, and they didn't understand what caused it. The next thing is they didn't understand germ theory. Now, I know it's a little weird to think about, but you and I, by the age of, I don't know, 8, we had a better understanding of what causes disease than a lot of these people did, because they still thought there was this idea that came out of ancient Greece, actually, about how disease spread. And they thought it was spread by bad air, particularly night air. And so they didn't realize that something on your hands or your body or on a chair or whatever could make you sick. They literally thought it was air, something drifting in through your window at night, or you walk someplace and run into a kind of an invisible cloud of illness and you die. It was not until the 1880s, so easily 50, 60 years after the writing of Frankenstein, that people finally accepted germ theory, the idea that itty bitty little invisible organisms could cause disease. So if you don't understand how diseases spread, you don't know how to stop it. And okay, next slide before I move on to this. Doctors didn't wash their hands between patients, which today we find that to be inconceivable, considering how often just your average person is encouraged to wash their hands, let alone a doctor. I found a quote, and I don't know where the quote is. I wrote this down, but I found a quote where he said, "I'm a gentleman. I don't have to wash my hands." And so at least part of the problem was doctors were considered to be kind of upper class people, gentlemen, and therefore they were good people and they were clean people. And you don't have to ask a gentleman to wash their hands. They're just naturally clean because they're not out working in the field, of course. And so it really was, I think, a matter of, well, if they didn't see any dirt or any blood on their hands, they didn't think they needed to wash. And so you can just imagine the horrific spreading of disease with that situation. The other issue probably larger than the doctor issue, was sewage was not separated from drinking water. Um, it wasn't that they didn't know that it should be. I just don't think they quite understood how bad it was, and they also didn't really understand how to do it very effectively. Um, there was a book I read in about London in the 1850s, and there was a cholera epidemic. Cholera is a disease that is purely spread whenever you come in contact with raw sewage. And if you don't come in contact with raw sewage, then you don't get cholera, full stop. And there was a doctor who worked for years to prove that there was a well in the middle of London where a bunch of people got their water, and the well got contaminated by sewage. And so anybody who drank from that well got sick. And he was one of those people that he was totally right in his lifetime, but it wasn't until after he was dead that people realized, oh, wait, he was right. Okay. Um, and so all of the diseases that come from raw sewage were still incredibly prevalent. And so you didn't know that. You know, you drank water that you thought was clean and you died. The reason why the British love tea so much, part of that is the fact that, you know, it was safer to drink because hot tea means you've boiled the water before you put the tea leaves in. And so you can see their kind of obsession with that from the fact that they probably clued in to boiling water made it safer to drink. This is an illustration, a backyard examined. I don't have any idea of when this picture was done or for what reason, but it's a good, and I hope an exaggerated view of just how horrific a backyard could be. The woman is dumping what's probably a chamber pot in her, what we would call like a septic tank today, but you'll notice that it's open. And then you have the outhouse. You have the farm animals. And I guess it looks like there's supposed to be like standing gunk here in the middle of this backyard. And the idea was, of course, that how could you escape illness and disease whenever you've got all of these sources of raw sewage sitting here in your backyard? The other thing here is that not only did they not understand how disease was happened and, you know, what caused it and how to prevent it, but they didn't really understand how to treat people very effectively either. One of the more popular options was bleeding people. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. They wounded you until you bled, and then they drained blood out of you. And the reason was, this is another old kind of ancient Greek idea, was that illness was in your bad blood. And if you could get the bad blood out, well, hey, you could get better. We know today this is a horrific idea. They did not. This is where the idea of using leeches came from. They also sometimes didn't use leeches. Sometimes they would have knives, a knife and a special knife for this, and they would cut your arm and let the blood drain. Now, you've probably been injured and you know what it is to bleed. Think about how big of a wound you have to have before the blood drains out of your body. They even had these specially made bowls with little U-shaped openings on the rim, so that your elbow could like sit down into the bowl, so that your blood could drain into the bowl and not everywhere. So this is a popular treatment, and people did not really understand. Well, they didn't understand anything about this, so they bled people. Very few medicines. And I'm not including kind of, I don't want to say herbal remedies, that's not what I'm talking about, but they didn't have widespread medicines, okay? There would be people who kind of had like handed down pain relievers and treatments, and there was a lot of that, but it was not considered like standardized. You know, they didn't teach those things in medical school. So I've got 3 medicines here that they had available. They had opium, which is the mother of all pain relief drugs. They also did not realize, in Mary Shelley's time at least, I think, how addictive it could be. Opium is what we make morphine from. All sorts of really, really powerful narcotic drugs come from opium. They had quinine, which is very effective for malaria, but not for much else, I don't think. And then the lovely idea of using mercury for syphilis. Syphilis is a venereal disease. It is transmitted through sexual contact with somebody who is sick, or it can be transferred from the mother to the fetus if she's infected when she's pregnant. And one of the treatments, one of the very few things they found that actually had a little bit of an effect on syphilis was mercury. Now, if you know anything about mercury, you know that it is deadly poison. And so the fact that they were willing to treat themselves with mercury, with this deadly, deadly poison, shows you just how desperate they were for some sort of treatment for syphilis. Smallpox. Smallpox was just kind of, it was everywhere. I don't know what you know, if anything, about smallpox. It's related to chicken pox, but it is far more severe. I looked up the death rate for smallpox and found very different um, ideas. And the one I think that's the most reliable was a 30% death rate, which doesn't sound that bad until you think about death rates for other diseases and how minuscule they are, like the flu. You know, today the death rate for the flu is less than 1%. You know, compare that and you can see that smallpox was a much bigger deal. Smallpox looks, smallpox, the little marks on your skin are far more close together. Sometimes they almost bleed into one and they're kind of flat. So it could leave you horribly, horribly scarred. Frequently, you went blind because the little wounds got into your eyes and blinded you. And so smallpox was very, very common. It was called smallpox, believe it or not, because they wanted to distinguish it from syphilis, which was called the great pox. The word pox is used to describe like some horrific disease or some horrific calamity. So it's called smallpox, not because it's small, but because it's not the great pox, which was syphilis, which tells you how common syphilis was, unfortunately. Okay, so medicine in Mary Shelley's time was very, they didn't know very much, which means that people died a lot. And so the fascination with death and dying and medicine that you're going to see in the novel, I think you can trace that very clearly to Mary Shelley living in this time period. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is, and this is something, these other ideas that are going to influence or show up as illusions in the novel. And so this, I'm just going to call this the state of a baby's soul, because you're going to see this idea very clearly in this novel. What is a baby, when you're born, are you born innocent? Are you born a sinner, etc.? Now, Christian theology teaches that original sin, that we are all born sinners. But in the 1700s, in that classicist era when they were all thinking about these things, they started to dispute that idea. So the first thing I want you to write down here is about John Locke, and he believed children were born a blank slate. He didn't think they were born evil. He didn't think they were born good. They were blank. And if the child grew up to be good or bad, that completely depended on how the child was raised. If the parents and or the society raised you to be good, then you were a good person. If they didn't, you were a bad person. That was it. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and you can just know his last name, he believed children were born good and had good natures. And his idea was very similar to Locke's, that it's society that teaches you to be bad. So Rousseau thought that every child born was good and that they only become bad because they learn it from other people. And so you're going to see these ideas and influencing the growing up of characters in the novel. Okay, this one is going to be an illusion. You're going to see references to this in the novel, and there are some similarities between this and Frankenstein. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and you don't really need to know his name. But you're going to see there are actually some specific, I think somebody may even quote this poem in the novel, and you definitely see some similarities. But basically, the story of a mariner is a sailor. And the word rhyme this is an old spelling of the word rhyme, like Rhyme, like we spell it. So basically, it's the story of the ancient sailor, the old sailor. And essentially what happens is you've got this sailor and he's headed like toward the South Pole on his ship, and they're going along just kind of minding their own business, and this bird keeps coming to the ship, an albatross, which is a seagoing bird, one of those birds that like spend their entire life flying on the ocean. Um, and this albatross, he's not bothering anybody, but it's like, why do you keep coming to the ship? We're not feeding you. We don't need you. What are you doing? And so the sailor, for some reason, kills the albatross. Like it wasn't doing anything bad. So he kills this bird, and eventually, and it's immediately, the powers that be, God or whatever is happening in this book, punish the entire ship. They are becalmed, they lose their wind, they can't make any progress, they run out of food, they run out of water. Everybody starts dying except the ancient mariner. And he is forced to stay on the ship and watch everybody die and suffer. Now, the first similarity between this and Frankenstein is they're both frame stories. And a frame story simply means there's a story happening within a story, like a picture frame. And the frame, the outer story, of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is the mariner, after he gets free from the ship, having to go around and as punishment tell his story to other people. And the gist of his story, of course, is that if you do something bad, you will be punished. Um, right, once he kills the bird, and before the rest of them die, I guess, they make him wear the carcass of the bird around his neck as punishment. And that's where the idiom of the albatross around your neck comes from. It's the idea that it's something you can't get rid of. It's dragging you down. And that's where this comes from, is this poem. This is a picture of an albatross. Looks very much like kind of a seagull, although they're bigger. And obviously you can't tell that in this painting. There's no scale, but an albatross is bigger than a seagull. And so here's the moral of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, that when you do something bad, you get punished. I know that's kind of simplistic, but that's essentially what it is. Here we have a kind of a cute little painting of a horrific scene. Here he's got the bird strapped to him. He's been drinking his own blood because he's so thirsty. I know that's charming. But that's the gist of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So you've got the idea of the frame story, and Frankenstein's a frame story too. And also the idea that when you do something bad, you get punished. Okay, the next story that is very important for Frankenstein is the Greek myth of Prometheus. And Prometheus is a titan, and he gives humanity fire, even though Zeus has told him not to. And then, of course, Zeus punishes him. Zeus punishes him by chaining him to a rock, and every day an eagle comes and pecks out his liver, and then at night it grows back, and the next day the eagle comes back and pecks out the liver, et cetera, et cetera. But Prometheus is being punished for giving humanity fire. And so you could look at it as the doing something bad equals punishment story, but I don't think that's really what this one's about. Here we've got a picture of Prometheus sneaking fire down from Mount Olympus, obviously. And then another picture of him being tormented by, sure doesn't look like an eagle to me, but whatever. No, the myth of Prometheus is really more of a creation story, because if you think about it, fire can symbolize life. And so you could say that when Prometheus gives fire to humans, he kind of brings humanity to life. And so if this is a creation story, hopefully you can see the parallels with Frankenstein, because Frankenstein too is a creation story. And the big deal and the big, clue that we need to pay attention to this myth is Mary Shelley subtitles her novel, The Modern Prometheus. If you look at your copy of the book, it says Frankenstein, The Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley. And so she is telling us as clearly as possible, she wants us to identify somebody in this novel with Prometheus. So kind of important there. The next story that is important in Frankenstein is Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is an epic poem about Adam and Eve's expulsion from the Garden of Eden. So the beginning of Genesis. And it's a British poem. It's an epic poem, so it's really long. It's kind of like it's supposed to be like the Odyssey, where it tells this big long story. And the author, John Milton, was a Puritan. And so he wanted to write an epic poem, but he wanted to use like a Christian story. So he uses Adam and Eve's expulsion as the source material for his poem. And here you've got a picture of them being, kicked out of the garden. Um, the thing is, and what makes it relevant for Frankenstein is that Satan, for most of the poem, is a far more interesting and sympathetic character than Adam or Eve. Adam is kind of annoying. Eve's not bad, but Adam's just downright annoying. And Milton did not intend for Satan to be seen as the romantic hero. And later, like farther into the book, he kind of realizes what he's done and he corrects his course, and Satan becomes monstrous again. But especially in the early books of this poem, Satan really winds up, people like him more than they like Adam and Eve. Let's see, I've got a painting. Here we've got a painting, an illustration from Paradise Lost. And this is Satan. And this, leaving aside the bat wings there, he looks like your classic romantic hero. He's got what looks like Roman armor on. He looks distressed, but he's alone. He looks very, he's got broad shoulders. He's very heroic looking, not normally how we think of Satan. This is an illustration of Paradise Lost from a later artist. And this one has Adam and Eve in it, but it also has Satan up there wrapped around the snake. But again, he doesn't look like a monster. If you didn't know this story, you would probably think the character at the top of this picture is supposed to symbolize an angel, just because he doesn't look like a monster. Okay, so Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Paradise Lost both are books that you will see references to and be able to draw parallels with. But now I want to give you some themes to look for in Frankenstein. Remember that a theme is kind of an idea that gets repeated in literature. And I think that it will be very evident as we go through this. You'll see them. The first one is man's inability to care for each other. Characters who just don't have any compassion. They don't have any empathy for other people. They cannot put themselves in somebody else's shoes. And this is going to be a very common theme, and you're going to see it leading to disaster very quickly. Judging others based on appearance, that's going to be the easiest one to find. Very, very early in the novel, you're going to see these characters seem to believe that if you are beautiful, if you are physically beautiful, that means you're good. And if you are physically ugly, it means you're bad. And they never go beyond that conception. Creation is a theme. Obviously, Victor Frankenstein is not female, but you're going to see over and over again references to him, childbirth, being a parent, being a mother. So those are going to be themes that are pretty easy to see. Nature is a big theme. As I said earlier, nature really acts to heal in this novel. All of the characters find comfort in going out and being in nature. And the cool thing about this is the majority of this novel is set in Switzerland, which is just jaw-droppingly gorgeous. And I think I actually have some photographs of Switzerland to show you. Yes, I do. These are photographs that my mother took when on her first trip, my parents' first trip to Switzerland in, as you can see, 2008. And so I've got some really beautiful pictures of the mountains. This is the Alps, so some of the highest mountains on the planet. Another shot, and you can really see, I mean, this kind of being out in this kind of nature, you couldn't help but it affect you. Again, here they're moving down the mountains. These mountains are high enough that they're the kinds of mountains that some people get altitude sickness when they go up far enough. They become lightheaded, nauseous, and this is kind of coming down. You can see from the date, she was taking these in August. So some really beautiful green land here. Notice again, this is also August. This is a glacier. They were far up, high up enough to actually take pictures of a glacier that does not melt. And that gives you an idea of just how high the elevation in the Alps can be. And then I've got a couple of pictures lower down. This, I'm thinking, one of the things she said was that glacier runoff was white. The water was white. And I'm hoping that's why I picked this picture. And then I've got two pictures of the lake. Switzerland is known for its lakes and how beautiful they are. There's one picture, and then the next one. This one, I think the color of the lake, you get kind of that idea of the glacier runoff again with kind of the whitish green um, water. But this gives you an idea that Switzerland is just really beautiful. And so it makes sense that nature would be able to heal its characters. The other thing you need to know is Mary Shelley was living in Switzerland when she came up with the idea for this novel. Okay. Another theme is the consequences of isolation, and to a lesser extent, fleeing the women in your life. Really, isolation is the issue here, is what happens when you isolate yourself from society. And I will tell you, nothing good. Another really big theme in this novel, and probably the reason why we continue to read this novel today, is the theme of scientific ethics. And this boils down to, just because we can do something, does that mean we should? Scientists, have the ability to do amazing things, but there needs to be a line. Just because you can experiment on human beings doesn't mean you should. Just because we can use animals as test subjects, does that mean we should? Just because we can blow up the planet with nuclear weapons, does that mean we should? And Victor Frankenstein is an excellent illustration of people who don't follow, don't pay attention to that line. So we're going to see this theme pretty easily. Okay, a couple last things here. Some connections with Mary Shelley's life. First one is, I've talked about this, the deaths in her family and in society really led to a fascination with illness and death. And so you see a motivation, a motive for some of the big things that happen in this novel, basically trying to conquer illness, trying to conquer death. The other thing is about alienation, and alienation is really another theme. I didn't mention it there, but it's pretty clear. But we know that she suffered alienation from society because of her parents' reputations, and then later her own actions. Running away with a married man. Good grief. And so the idea that people shun you and that you're not welcome in normal society, we saw that happen in her life, and you are definitely going to see that happen in this novel. A couple of maps. This is a map of Switzerland. You can see, if you don't know, Switzerland is a landlocked country. You've got France on the left, and Germany, Austria, and Italy over on the right. The majority of this book takes place in Switzerland. It moves around a lot, but this is kind of the most time is spent in Switzerland. And then here is a map of all of Europe. Switzerland is here in the orange. And we start in Switzerland, but we definitely spend some time in Germany, a little bit in France, not a lot. We have a brief stopover for like a microsecond in Italy. But England, Scotland up here, all the way up here, actually. And then over into Ireland for a little bit, and then kind of the climax of the novel, the kind of the final phase of the novel. We actually kind of take a tour that goes down south through the Mediterranean, up through the Black Sea, up through Russia, and up into the Arctic. So really moves around. And okay, that is the end of this. Hopefully I've given you a whole lot of information and you've been able to write it down before your hand just totally gave up. And hope this helps.